And now we're going to look at poem 154 by Emily Dickinson, otherwise known as Word Drop Careless. Although one of the shorter poems set for study, A Word Drop Careless conveys a concentrated and passionate message which reveals the wit, candour and provocation which characterises much of Dickinson's poetry. In order to understand this poem and how it relates to belonging, you need to appreciate Dickinson's perspective that language is powerful and can provoke great emotion. As she said in a letter introducing the first stanza of this poem to her cousins, "We must be careful what we say. No bird resumes its egg." Through the poem, we learn language can alienate and infect, and can restrict one from developing a sense of belonging to text and the world it represents. Identifying as a poet means for Dickinson the acknowledgement that there is a responsibility to use words carefully, to break convention and maintain individuality. Using her poem in an ironic fashion, she does do all of the above. She celebrates individuality and the freedom and empowerment one can achieve by choosing not to belong, to distinguish from the perpetual seam of conformity and convention. Throughout this poem, which you can now see on the screen, we gain insight into the way total independence of social constructs, in this case literary conventions, may enable a more authentic experience of belonging and selfhood. Dickinson emancipates herself and her art from such conventions of her patriarchal contemporaries and proves, through this poem, that she has the power to be. And now a closer look at the first stanza. The impersonal first stanza concerns the longevity of writing. Dickinson first notes a relationship between poetry or writing of the wrinkled maker and the stimulation of the reader. In the first two lines, her tone becomes quite clear. The conditional may, connected with the singular I, alludes to only a superficial relationship with possibly a one-dimensional effect if words are dropped carelessly. She asserts the notion here that words must be used to stimulate more than just the singular I. The way literary uniformity can constrict is represented well through her reference to the perpetual seam, referring to a kind of eternal confinement. In this instance, she may be referring to the actual seam on a hem and using this as a rather concrete example of a final enclosure. One may then assume the perpetual seam is a metaphor for death, the ultimate hem, the ultimate example of confinement. Given the reference to folded, such a grave may also be considered the folds of a book, which places her criticism firmly in the poetic world. Given Dickinson's 19th century context and being a female poet, one may even consider her reference to the wrinkled maker, combined with the perpetual seam, suggestive of the outdated mode and style of poetry in her predominantly patriarchal world and industry. The dominant conventions created by a seam which confine and even imprison creativity is really the subject of her poem. Note the homophone in seam and seam, which becomes a reminder of the inability of any wrinkled maker to stimulate more than the eye. It's an appearance only. Hence her impersonal tone is a way of distancing herself from this world of conventional and careless writing, which only has a limited impact on the reader. While this impact may be limited, it can also be dangerous. In the second stanza, Dickinson moves into a more concrete image, as she explicitly explores the relationship between the poet, the word, and the reader, who helps create meaning. Dickinson knew that poetic influence does not die with the death of the writer. In another of her poems, not one set for study, Dickinson wrote, "The poets light but lamps, themselves go out." As the poem continues, Dickinson notes that each age will become a lens, disseminating their circumference. Through each age, society and the reader will interpret. The words will live on and create meaning, potentially infection. So her message becomes clear. Words must be used carefully. Her representation of language being decoupled from the author is reminiscent of Roland Barthes' Death of the Author, and if you'd like some extension work, it may be worthwhile looking this up. In this essay, Barthes makes the point that while the origin of a work may lie with the author, its destination is with the reader. This concept echoes Dickinson's notion of that poets only light a lamp. The poet's self will disappear. Hence, the onus on the writer to use words carefully becomes evident. Unlike her earlier reference to words being dropped careless, which only stimulate an eye, her first decorative statement that has such finality provokes a visceral reaction in the reader. Here, Dickinson adopts a medical metaphor. She conjoins infection with inhale to unite the power of words to alienate and destroy, so we contract despair. The first person plural we in the second stanza turns the stimulation of an I into a collective experience. The word has become a sentence, and it now has power. We may also refer to women writers, particularly of Dickinson's context, who can be infected by the fever-inducing style of male predecessors and their perpetual seams of literary convention. Hence, understanding your own identity and understanding self and style can engender a more authentic sense of belonging, and Dickinson is using her poem to urge others to do just that. The way distances and centuries phonetically resemble each other allows her to emphasise the echo and stretch of the disease, which continues throughout time. Language can exert power and can corrupt, can even produce malaria. The parasitic presence of poetic forefathers, the wrinkled makers, seems a fitting comparison for the infection of poetic convention, which can inhibit an individual poet, particularly a female one in the 19th century, from developing and maintaining an original style. By disenfranchising herself from such convention, she showcases her deep respect for words and communication. Self-reliance is central to a transcendent experience of belonging. And remember, from a transcendentalist perspective, it is only when one is truly independent that a genuine community can be formed. Some useful notes from écriture state, so Dickinson's style, being subversive, the irony, inverted power relations, unconventional ideas, relates to her aim to forge a new identity for herself, whereby she can situate language as the figurehead of her self-made state. She achieves belonging through positioning her context as contained and subservient to poetic expression. Poetry becomes godly, and through it she transcends the limitations and frustrations of the physical world. This poem, then, is in some ways an exploration of what literary critic Sandra Gilbert calls the tensions and anxieties, hostilities and inadequacies writers feel when they confront not only the achievements of predecessors, but the traditions of genre, style and metaphor that they inherit from such forefathers. Hence, and that's the end of Sandra Gilbert's quote, hence we can look at this poem from a feminist perspective. Ultimately, we realise, through her representation of poetic form and style, that a strong individual must struggle against convention and maintain originality and selfhood.